Hello and welcome to the Explorer's Journal, the first, and thus the best, Ark World podcast. Join me south of the Draken's Fall and north of the Jernspeak. Join me from the farthest western point of Esandaluca to the eastern shores of Halvamain. The mages in the Mildark provide me the room and the magic at Mount Orion to project my voice all around the world of Archimundi Altius. On today's episode, I'll be discussing the Undead Raiders. So we're going to talk about some strategies for playing these spooky zombies. We'll talk about the equipment options that they can use, and we'll have some fun along the way. Just a quick disclaimer before we start. The information that's going to be presented is based on the current rules for the Undead Raiders, released in April of 2020, and some of the models released in the Christmas sale that year. So some changes may occur as updates to the factions happen. So let's talk about the Undead Raiders as a general faction. The quality of the models is insanely good. You know, you have like the little rats that look like rats. They're kind of spooky, scary, a little creepy. One of my favorites is the big old ogre, especially with that little guy hanging out on his back with the sword in him. I guess that guy might be the driver. Who knows? I enjoy the Will-o'-the-Wisp. She's a pretty cool model. She's very easy to paint if you want some ethereal paint jobs on her. And the Executioner, he has so much character in him. You know, the way he extends his arm out is to say, "You're next." It's a really cool faction that I think is very underappreciated. And with the Headless Horseman released as well, such a fantastic model. Alex is knocking it out of the park time and time again with these guys. And I think his strategy of making the Raiders more of a versatile faction, where a model could play multiple different roles depending on what you, the player, want, I think that's a smart thing to do, especially since they are considered the least popular faction right now. The general playstyle of the Undead Raiders is that they use very cheap models to protect slightly less cheap models. So you have those rats that should be leading the charge with their higher speed while your units move up the field. The Undead Raiders also tend to do this death by 1,000 cuts approach. Like, a lot of the power in the faction is fairly middling or kind of low, but for the most part, you'll have enough bodies to overcome that. And another big thing about this death by 1,000 cuts approach is that you're provided a lot of battlefield control. So the Will-o'-the-Wisp with her lore, everything that the old Mana Bones can do, all of the AP reducing or armor reducing power and abilities that your undead have, and the Fearsome on the Ogre, these are all things that you can leverage to control the battlefield. And for the most part, games with the Raiders are going to be won or lost based on how well you can do this. So for the most part, you have to know your enemy's army as well as or better than they do, because you can't win in a straight up fight. You're not knocking out the Imperial Ogre, you're not knocking out the Thing Flinger, you're not knocking out the Pack Master. Like, they're all just gonna knock you down. And this all does come at a price. The more expensive characters tend to have lower than average health and AP for what they are. So the Ogre, he has less AP than the mentioned Thing Flinger. He has no ranged options, so even though his stats match the Imperial Ogre has that extra 50 gold volley gun. So you need to play carefully to keep a lot of your key characters alive. And the Undead Raiders, with their ability to raise the dead, they kind of provide an interesting middle point between the attrition and summoning power of the Wild Elves and the power and presence of the Imperials. The Undead Raiders won't win a game at range, and they won't win a game at melee for the most part. They have to kind of leverage every ability they have in their arsenal. So the Raise the Dead and the lore and all the crowd control abilities that they have. So now, let's talk about the equipment options for the faction. We'll also throw in a couple that aren't currently there, but can be. So things like shields and heavy armor, they're not in the Undead Raiders' arsenal, but they could easily be added later. Raiders are kind of a slower faction, and kind of easy to knock out, so anything that helps them survive is going to help them immensely. They're, for the most part, only a little more durable than some Imperial troopers, but anything that you can do to make sure that the bandits get there and that Harbinger stays alive are things that will help you so much. Then there's also two-handed weapons. And raiders, they don't tend to do a lot of damage, so anything to boost it would be great. But the two-hand weapon downside could hurt in the long run. Every time you roll a 6, it counts as a failure on defense. You don't want to have an entire warband full of two-hand weapon wielders, and you don't want anyone too important to have a two-handed weapon. But you can have a couple of bandits that have two-handed weapons, and you'll be fine. They'll provide a nice bit of power that you otherwise wouldn't have. Spears are also something worth talking about. Raiders are a slow faction. They're speed 4. They don't have a lot of ranged options. So a spear, being a universal threat extender, is a great way to give you that little extra bit of chance to get into combat instead of being shot up on the way. Because nothing is worse than being within 2 inches of someone you want to attack and being unable to do so. Dual weapons, on the other hand, have no downsides, in my opinion, except that you can't wield something else. Rerolling 1s is a huge deal in this game. A rerolled 1 could become a 6, and that opens up a ton of critical effects. Just a ton. So anything that could reduce AP or armor is great, because anything that can control your opponent is going to control the game, and that's how you win. Then there's torches, which are a very cheap option. Now, there's a lot of stuff in faction that's flammable, so it might not be a good idea to bring them along, but they could help you deal with beasts. Torches do give you a little punch if you're versing someone else playing the raiders, and they could also help you against wild elves. The ranged weapon option, it's kind of equal to our melee options, but it has range. So it's not going to win games, you're not going to outgun other factions, but the longer range is useful and it gives you a better presence on the table to bring enemies to you. So if someone wants to sit back and try to hide from you, they cannot, because you're going to be shooting them. And if they have to move forward, that brings them up to your army of rats, who can hold them in place so the rest of your army can get to them. And then there's the soul jar, which is a pretty cheap way to keep models alive. I like to put it on the old mana bones because it can help counter crumbling. A lot of the time that you're using him, he's going to be probably around half health by the game's end if he hasn't been attacked. And this kind of guarantees that if he does get attacked, he shouldn't go down for the most part. You could also put it on the Harbinger. And the Harbinger could use it on himself, which is probably the best use of it. But he can also raise the dead and use it on the raised character to heal them back up to full. And for the Harbinger, and for most of your characters, it's a pretty good insurance for when the stolen pistol misfires. Because if there's one thing that has plagued me game after game, it's that pistol misfiring. And you end up doing more damage to yourself than your opponent does to you. And it just costs games sometimes. Other than that, there is the mount. Extra movement's always good. Extra health is always good. Agile is great to get you up the field. There isn't too much to say about the mount. It's totally worth that 35 gold price. Like, you put your Harbinger on that mount, and suddenly he can move to unexpected places, and you could really spread out your army, because if someone gets knocked out on one side of the table, your Harbinger can ride along, possibly catch up to that guy and raise him, when otherwise he wouldn't be able to. I would like to see the old mana bones on him out, mostly because I think it would be funny. I don't think he necessarily needs one, and in fact it would tie him down, but it also would give him more threat angles to cast spells. And the last thing that the Undead Raiders have in their armory is the Stolen Arclock Pistol. It's a low-range gun, but it has decent power. It has also a pretty significant chance of hurting you as much as you hurt the enemy, and that's something to keep in mind. Just like you wouldn't equip your entire warband with two-handed weapons, you probably won't equip them all with pistols. You want a good mix. It's the variety that you can bring. So we talked about the equipment options. Let's talk about the guys that can be equipped. So first we have the Undead Harbinger. On his own, he's not particularly strong, but he gives you access to raise the dead, and that is one of the strengths of the Raiders. The medium feat requirement at minimum is kind of a big ask, because the 2 successes could come across as kind of hard to do, especially in a critical moment, and also especially if you want to use his AP to do other things. He also has his swashbuckle attack, and it's his higher power attack, and it can help control the enemy, because it should statistically be a little better than a 75% chance to roll at least 1 6 on 8 dice, and that's something that you always have to think about. Vicious Slash can ignore armor, meaning that in many cases it could outdamage Swashbuckle, but if you need the battlefield control, Swashbuckle is going to be your attack. For commanders, 11 health is a little frail. I mean, when you compare it to the Halfling and Imperial commanders, it's not, but they also come with light armor baked in. So what it comes down to is using Raise the Dead smartly, because that's his biggest strength. Or it's almost comparable to the Wild Elves, where he could bring back the characters that were knocked out with half their health. Sometimes it's worth bringing back a character in an important spot. We'll talk about that a little later. But one thing to keep in mind is that Raise the Dead is doubly potent, as the race character can activate as normal in that round. While it's mostly going to be used to bring back bandits who will have 4 life with it, it could also be worth bringing back someone like an Executioner or a Will-o'-the-Wisp. And if the Harbinger gets overwhelmed, he can also Soul Eater to gain his health, as it'll pretty much heal him for over a third of his health if he uses it on a bandit. And then there's also something to be said about taking risks with Raise the Dead. Like, if you were to have 3 or 4 characters knocked out within 6 inches, it could be worth rolling single dice and hoping for 6s to bring back bandits. As I mean, you have 4 chances to get a 6 or more. It's high risk, but the reward could be worth it, especially if you get more than 1 6. So you raise more than 1 character. And if you're already going to lose, it's not like it's going to be the game-losing play. The Harbinger loves the Stolen Arcalock pistol so much that it's part of his sculpt. So general play for the Harbinger is going to be to shoot the enemy while advancing just behind the lines to resurrect your fallen. So a lot of the time I find myself using 2 AP to attempt to raise the dead, shooting, and using 2 AP for the shooting feat to guarantee that it successfully goes off. If I'm feeling particularly lucky, I'll use 3 AP for Raise the Dead, and just 1 AP for the shooting test, and you see what happens. But you do not want the Harbinger to get into melee combat unless you really need him to. After that's the Old Man of Bones. He's tied for the second most health out of the mages, but that doesn't make him nearly as bulky as his elf and orc counterparts, and that's because of Crumbling. Crumbling will slowly strip him of health as the game goes on, so I like to think of the Old Man of Bones as being as fragile as a caster that has 7 or 8 health, and when you treat him like that, you'll play him well. In a pinch, he can be ran to the front lines to soak up damage, as he could take a lot of damage when it's needed. But you do have to be careful. He does not have the raised trait, so if he stays knocked out permanently when he gets knocked out. Fly is such a good ability. I think it's one of those things that you can pay a premium for, and it'll always be worth it. The ability to ignore things on the battlefield is huge. You can hide behind a building out of line of sight, and then fly over it instead of having to use all that movement to go around it to make an attack. So you can make yourself almost invulnerable by hiding behind terrain that is otherwise impassable, and the terrain that prevents line of sight to you. Now, one of the things that has been discussed has been the Old Man of Bones has Soul Eater, which requires him to have the Raise the Dead trait. So we'll operate under the assumption that he has Raise the Dead, and if we're wrong, I'll own up to it for you. He is a second source of Raise the Dead, and that gives you additional chances at doing it, and he could Soul Eater for health if Crumbling and attacks against him start really taking him out. For the most part, you're going to be using 2 AP to cast spells, leaving you just 1 AP left. And it's not a bad idea to use that 1 AP to try to raise a character. It's not like failure causes any big issues. And if you were to have Arcanite, you can use it to cast a spell for free and then raise the dead with 2 or 3 AP instead. So let's talk about his spells. He has a very interesting spell list. He has Deathly Chill, which is his first spell, so it's easiest to cast, and one of his most powerful. Reducing an opponent's AP by D3 is huge, especially if you land it on an elite or a commander. On average, you remove 2 AP, and that's going to be close to half or more than half of a character's AP, severely limiting what they can do that round. And if you're 12 inches away from that target, at maximum range of the spell, you're also really safe when you cast it. If you cast it on someone, say a regular infantryman, which you should try not to do, they have 0 AP. They can move up and they can stare at you. If you cast it on an enemy commander, they'll have 2 or 3 AP. So they can move up and they're extremely limited in what they can do. If you cast it on an elite, they usually only have 3 AP, maybe 4. So now they're left with 1, 2, none. You just used your old mana bones to take out 70 gold's worth of model. And that model wasn't even knocked out. His second spell is Bone Gnawer, and it's interesting. It gives you a free carrion rat with the caveat that it cannot be raised when knocked out. I said free, but that's not entirely true. The opportunity cost of casting Bone Gnawer over other spells that he has could be huge. Carrion rats aren't really that strong, but they can absorb an attack that might otherwise target someone else, and the rats do have decent enough speed to tie down a ranged attacker. So if someone's a little over 17 inches away from your old mana bones, you can move the old mana bones up, summon the rat, and then the rat can activate later in that round and get to them, which will require no legate rolls. And that person could be 17 inches away, which is quite a long range. And if you were to be inclined to cast Bone Gnawer every single round over the course of 5 or 6 rounds, you basically created an extra 75 to 90 gold. Is that enough of an advantage in a game? It could be. It could be. The third spell that the old mana bones can cast is Soul Drain. And it's a pretty good hybrid offensive-defensive spell. It can do 3 hits that ignore armor, and that could be a huge deal, or it could fall flat. You know, if you roll 1 success or no successes on 3 dice, that hurts. But if you roll 5 successes on 3 dice, that's pretty big. It also heals the old mana bones for the amount of damage that it dealt, which is a great way to keep them in the game when you're rolling hot. Now, one of those things that I guess could be a point of debate is the range of the spell. Because as listed, it does not have a maximum range, meaning you could cast it on someone turn 1 for early chip damage, as long as you have line of sight. I don't think a power 3 spell is necessarily strong enough that it needs to. You know, a lot of spells in the game don't have ranges, but it could be one that could use one, especially if you can take out most of a character's health on a lucky roll with 0 risk to you. Because casting it on something that's 20, 30 inches away, it doesn't feel right, but at the same time, line of sight's a thing. Now, Resurrection is his Big Daddy spell. It can return any character at all, that you hired for your warband to the table, and it does not require them to have the raised talent, or for you to be within 6 inches of where they fell. So you could bring back an Undead Ogre, you could bring back Rabbit Tood, you could bring back whoever. The strongest part is that that character can activate even if they already activated that round, which means you're double dipping into an activation, and that is massive. Massive, massive. So you can run an important character on a suicide mission towards their target. That character gets knocked out, you resurrect them, and they just do it again. You resurrect your Harbinger, have him raise the dead, and you're triple dipping, pretty much, which is phenomenal. There are so many possibilities for this spell. It'll be somewhat risky, but I think it's always going to be worth overcharging it if that happens. Don't be afraid to overcharge this spell. It's going to pay back dividends in a big way. Then we have our Undead Bandits, the bread and butter troops, the rotten meat of the list. They're slightly more expensive than other factions' comparable units, but they also do have a little more health than average. So they're 5 points more expensive than the Halfling Militia or the Imperial Trooper, but they have 1 extra health over them. Their attack Guttum has the ability to ignore armor through critical hits, so there's some good damage potential against armored targets. And bandits are also very average stat-wise, which means that they take well to any weapon and armor configuration, so they're that typical jack of all trades but master of none, and they're not terribly expensive for it. Unlike other factions, though, they don't have the innate ability to increase their power or to activate more models, so they don't have the make orders and take orders. But when it comes to figuring out who to raise, they'll probably be your first, if not your only choice. They have 7 health, and odd numbers are magic numbers in Ark World, because most things round up, which means that 7 health model comes back with 4 health. And that 1 extra health over something that would have 6 health is huge. And 4 health is the point where you kind of hope they take more than 1 dedicated attack to remove. When it comes to bandits, there's a ton of options for what you could equip them with. Mounted raiders with ranged weapons can kite opponents, so you can shoot and then move back and just keep doing that and harassing. If they're mounted, they can also be a flanking unit. I never want to see cavalry as the front line. They're too expensive to throw in like that. You want your cavalry to come around the side, crash into the enemy, and break their ranks. So with their speed, it's also possible to wrap a mounted bandit around your opponent's warband and attack from the rear. And that's always nice. If you were to put an Arcalock pistol on them, it's a 75 gold package, and you don't have to worry too much about misfires, because they can be raised. The stolen pistol and the ranged weapons, they could soften targets enough to go in for the kill. But any of your rangers should be your second or third wave. Your first wave should be your rats, your second wave should be your melee bandits, your third wave should be your ranged bandits. And then we have the Executioner. And the Executioner has the, I guess you could say, the highest potential damage against 30mm targets in the game, since it's technically infinite. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about how your opponent might respond to that. Your opponent should try to target down Executioners from range to prevent decapitation from ever being a factor. As it is, he's also the squishiest elite in the game, so you want to invest in armor, soul jars, and maybe shields, just to make sure that he makes it to his target. And while it takes a hard feat to be raised, you could change the tide of the game with a successful raise, because he can be raised and then go for another decap against an opposing commander or elite or whatever. So with the Executioner, you want to target models without shields first, since the shield can prevent decapitation from occurring, and that can leave your Executioner in a bad position. And it shouldn't have to be said, but let's just say it. Don't put him against models on bases bigger than 30mm. That's not his strong suit. He's not going to win a slog. He doesn't have the damage for it, especially not against something that he can't kill in one swing. So round after round, decapitation first. Because if you knock out that target, you can follow up with the weighty hack on a second target. And what makes decap so strong is that potential, that 50-50 shot that the opponent is completely knocked out from full health because they failed their first defensive roll. And that's why you want to stay away from shielded models, because that changes the math in an entirely different way. So one thing I like to do, I call the Executioner trap, and I like to rush him forward to get knocked out on purpose sometimes. Well, not on purpose, but it'll happen. So what you do is you keep him knocked out until there's a high-value 30mm opposing character that may have forgotten about him and parked within 4 or so inches, and then you raise him and attempt to decap them. And this has worked to great effect, because it kind of catches your opponent by surprise. It's like an alligator waiting in the water while the deer is drinking from the water, and then he hops up and grabs him. The big thing is that he is a slow damage dealer. So you want to use your army to escort him to his target. And giving his weapon a longer shaft by upgrading it to a pseudo-spear weapon, I guess you could say, also gives him that extra 2-inch distance that he can use if he can't quite reach the opponent to get a decap off. After him, we have our Undead Ogre. And it's big and it's expensive, but it has some pretty decent damage potential and it can absorb a real beating. So his squishiness is somewhat countered by fearsome, which gives you a pretty decent chance to kind of stretch your health further and make you almost invincible with decent luck. And then there is the control that Bludgeon offers you at decent power, where if you hit... Yep, it's Nick from the future, editing this video. The Ogre knocks down on a critical hit, not a regular hit. Alright, back to the show. Then you knock down the opponent. And that's great, because you can follow it up with Stomp, and that cranks your damage up. So you can deal some pretty incredible damage if you get a critical hit on Bludgeon and follow up with 3 Stomps. And then if you want to, you could throw a 2-handed weapon on the Ogre, and he's going to be doing some pretty big damage. So a good strategy with Bludgeon is setting up a Bludgeon for your Executioner to come in later and try to decap, because a model knockdown by Bludgeon has a higher chance of failing their first defensive roll against the Executioner's decap. And that's a strategy that could win games. The Ogre also has Vomit, which is a low-power, short-range attack, but it has strength in that it gives potential bravery tests. So you can, if you can't close the distance in melee, you should probably use Vomit as often as possible, just to guarantee multiple bravery tests. And more tests means more chances for failure. And unlike Fearsome, Vomit works against the same size and larger base sizes. So it's a great way to get something the size of you or bigger to run away. Vomit also can keep your Ogre from being kited around the battlefield. So you threaten about 10 inches on Vomit, which isn't a lot, especially with guns that can threaten 12 or 16 or 20. But it's something. It can help you eventually catch up to those ranged characters and cause fear test in them. Maybe it requires a little luck on the Legate front, but hey, whatever happens. The Ogre, with his health stat being lower than average for a heavy, and also being flammable, he's kind of squishy against models that can resist his scary presence, and models that provide flaming attacks. So you want to watch out for halflings that have a healthy serving of Cocklegriff, Madras, and orcs with pet Drogos, especially, because these are things that will deal a lot of damage to you. But for the most part, the Undead Ogre is a great model to just wade into the middle of a combat full of smaller based enemies to cause multiple fear tests. And it's doubly effective against mounted enemies, as they flee a pretty respectable distance away, but you do have to catch up to them first. So now we get on to the Will-o'-the-Wisp, which is probably one of my favorite models in the faction, if not the game. So stat-wise, she's incredibly average, but her abilities are so unique. You have the ability Witchfire, which is low POW, but it affects a fairly large area, and the power increases if a character hit is flammable. So it's great against wild elves, especially if they clump up their little wood creatures, the wood fiends and the Lycanhawks. And the best part is that Witchfire ignores armor, so that lower power could also be a little misleading. Ethereal Caress is kind of an interesting ability. So since it doesn't have a base AP cost, it seems to require an easy feat before rolling for damage, which makes it sort of similar to a ranged attack. And I can see why, because at 5 power, which ignores armor, it's incredibly strong, especially into enemies wearing heavy armor. So things like the Halfling Town Guard, most commanders that wear armor, just ignoring that for 5 power is a pretty big deal. And the thing about the Will-o'-the-Wisp is that she can also fly like the old Mana Bones, So getting into combat should never be an issue for her. It's the same thing. You can hide behind a building until it's time to strike. You can hide behind terrain and just work your way forward. So all of that alone makes the Wisp a pretty strong fighter against armored foes, but her real ability is in Lure of the Light. And Lure is a huge area ability that can facilitate every other element in your warband by forcing the enemy closer to you. Or you can keep your Wisps to the far sides of your warband and use Lure to bring the enemy away from you. So on average, models and characters have 8 bravery, which gives them about a 30% chance to fail their bravery check. But you can affect such a wide area, it's 8 inches out, that it's almost guaranteed to work on somebody. And the thing with Lure that makes it so strong, even if it only takes 1 out of 5 enemies, or 1 out of 3 enemies statistically, it'll pull them out of formation, and that could really mess with someone's plans. So if a ranged character gets lured, they end up moving towards your warband, meaning that their superior ranged attack distance is somewhat negated. So a Wisp should always be near an Undead Ogre or an Executioner as offensive support if you want to go that route, because you can lure the enemy to an Ogre to cause bravery tests, or you could lure the enemy towards the Executioner, which makes it easier to get into melee for the decapitations. One of the things I like to do with the Wisp is, if I'm near a friendly Undead Ogre, I make Ogre Bombs. So if the Ogre only has 1 or 2 health left, and it's already activated, use Witchfire. It has a pretty high chance to knock him out, and that causes a very flammable explosion, which will knock down and deal damage to everything within 3 inches of him. That includes your Wisp, but it's alright, because that's a huge area for damage and knockdowns that you otherwise wouldn't have. After that is our last and certainly not least characters, the Carrion Rats. So if you run your Undead Raiders without Carrion Rats, it's like you're playing a turtle without a shell. Outside of mounted characters, they're the fastest thing in faction. And while they don't have a lot of survivability in and of themselves, they provide a ton of survivability and utility to the rest of your warband. The entire point of rats is to be a tar pit. They're cheap, they get in the way, and while they're doing that, you maneuver the rest of your army. With 3 health, they probably die in 1 attack, but it means that the enemy has to stop to perform that attack. And it means that that is one thing between you and the enemy that isn't something important. You do have to be careful about what you tie up, because they are flammable, and that causes a lot of problems against the halflings if you do starter box games, as 2 of their characters carry torches to begin with. Torches are cheap, they're 5 gold, and rats are only bravery 5, so it's a pretty cheap counter to a very cheap model. And that's one of the things you don't want. You know, the torch is 3 times cheaper than the rat, so you don't want to be countered by something that cheap. In terms of offense, there isn't a lot. You have Death Leap, which can close the distance to a target if you need an extra 2 inches, but that risk of killing the rat is always something to think about. It's kind of a medium risk, medium reward ability. And then you have Bite. It's just 3 power, so it'll do chip damage, but it's probably not going to win you games. Rats should never really be a target for Raise the Dead, unless your Harbinger has nothing better to do. But with the small size of rats, you should keep terrain in mind. Rats are shorter than halflings, so they can be completely concealed in terrain that is lower than a halfling. If you play the rats like stalking wolves or panthers, you'll never be disappointed. You know, you move from place to place under the cover of a wall or a tree line or whatever it is, and you strike when it's necessary. And the most important thing about rats is how you use them. You can send 1 rat to engage 1 person, 1 rat to engage another, a 3rd rat to engage a 3rd. And that's well and good. But that means each of those guys might only need to swipe away a rat once. you want them to operate kind of like a pack. So what you can do is you can send multiple rats at a single target to form a shell around that target if you want. And that means that person's really stuck in. Or what you can also do is send one rat at a time, but keep one rat about 6 inches away. So when the first rat gets knocked out, you could send in the second, and just tie this person up for as many rats as you have. So hopefully you can sort of see how you can layer various elements of the warband in elegant ways that makes your opponent work with you to win the game for you. So up front you have the rats, and the rats form that protective shell, while you position your will-o'-the-wisp to bring enemies towards you, while you position your ogre to force enemies away from you with bravery checks, while you position your executioner to knock out enemies, and while you position every other element to gain battlefield advantage. And when you do this right, when you can control the battlefield, and when you get a little lucky, you're going to win games. You will win so many games with the Raiders that you don't think you should have won, but it's a whole different experience than winning purely through power. You know, you have the Beast Folk that they'll wump you and they'll win through just damage and damage and damage. You have the Imperials that'll win by shooting you from halfway across the table. But no other faction so far has you win because your opponent plays into your plans with no other choice. And I think that's a good place to leave this off, because the Undead Raiders are my favorite faction, and we're going to talk a bit more about, purchasing order, out-of-faction hiring, and other experiences that I've had with this fantastic faction. And until then, I'll see you. What are you sticking around for? You expecting more squeaky chair and me ending this with the old "have a wonderful Mildark day"? I could do that. In fact, I just did. So, yeah. Again, have a wonderful Mildark day. See ya.